Okay. So I don't know if there's many more people gonna come. But a lot of people seem to be looking at the PowerPoint. Mm. Hello. Oops. Alright, so I'm going to be going over the Japanese phonetic writing system. Some of you are probably kind of have an idea of what it has in it. So I'll also introduce myself. I am Yu, or Pumi, or Poo, but I go by Yu on the server. And you have my username right there. Japan on the map is over here. So you can see this entire little clump of islands. So for the Japanese phonetic writing system, there's 3 different types. There's hiragana, which is these little examples. They're very like circular, has little loops on it. There's katakana, and katakana is a lot harsher on the lines. The lines are a lot straighter. Katakana is a Japanese syllabary, so is hiragana. So the writing system that they use goes by syllables. So a, e, I, o, u, ka, ki, ku, ku, ka, ke, ki, ko, ku. I'm missing some. And then when it comes down to kanji, hello.
Hello.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
And then kanji are these kind of more complicated looking Chinese characters. So if you want to read the actual definitions that I pulled from, I think like Wiki, you can go ahead and read those off of the PowerPoint. That isn't really my aim for today. I just want you to see the difference between all of them. So all 3 of them are necessary in order to create the Japanese writing system. So if you're thinking like you can only use one, that's not going to happen in reality. All Japanese people use all 3 of the writing systems in order to read, talk, write. So you kind of need to know all of them. So if you look back at the example that I had in that one other page, we have terebi wo miru mimasu. So television is going to be used in katakana. Katakana are the more harsher lines over here. And the reason why it's called terebi is because it's a borrowed word from the English language. So whenever they use katakana, they're more likely borrowed words from other different languages or foreign languages. Wo right here, or o, is a particle that identifies terebi. Kanji, this little character right here is the kanji for the word to see, miru. And then they conjugate it using hiragana. So when you conjugate the verb, this kanji, it goes mimasu. So terebi o mimasu. I watch television. So again, this little block is for your information. I kind of already went over it. So I'm going to go ahead and skip forward. So the first part that we want to focus on is the basic hiragana syllables. Basic hiragana syllables, there are 46 in total. Once you memorize them, you'll pretty much have the skill to transcribe all of the Japanese sounds because it uses all of the Japanese sounds that there are. And we'll be going over the general gist of them. So then here are the most basic of the hiragana syllables. A, I, U, E, O, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. These are the ones that you're going to want to memorize first. And it'll be easier if you just kind of either do rote memorization, so you write them down a lot of the time, or repeatedly in order to memorize them, or you can also use mnemonics, which I'll pull up in a while. So then another important thing to note is that these syllables, shi, chi, and tsu, are closer to the English pronunciation. So what does that mean? Is that pretty much they are pronounced the same way that it would be spelled in the romanization. Whereas the other different vowels have different pronunciations than we would read them. So like right here, you would think E, but the sound E is actually E. A, I, U, E, O. So you have to pay attention to the way that they do pronounce it. There's also a pronunciation guide at the end of this little section, which I'll point out and I'll show you guys, so that you can always go back and check the way that you're pronouncing it, the way that you're remembering them. And then you also want to remember this section, which are also part of the most basic part, hiragana. Ma, mi, mu, me, mo, ya, yu, yo, ra, ri, ru, re, ro, wa, and o, and n. So then you should always pay attention to stroke order whenever you're memorizing it or you're writing it repeatedly, because this is going to affect a lot of the ways that like you're going to be communicating with other people, or the way, even the neatness of your characters. So if you follow the stroke order, your characters are going to be a lot neater because that's the way that they were meant to be written in. And then another thing that I want to note is that this is a really good guide, except that it also includes two different characters, we and we, which are no longer used. So you don't have to memorize those, although they look kind of cool, so if you want. So the first activity that's on the PowerPoint, if you want to go back to the PowerPoint and practice it, is write each of the basic hiragana 30 times before proceeding. So it's an activity so that you can kind of get used to the way that they're written and try to begin memorizing it. If you click here on the pronunciation guide, this is the guide that's going to take you to a website that actually, if you click on each character, it'll tell you how they pronounce it in Japanese. So that's a really cool thing, and I'll go over it again after the PowerPoint. So hiragana with diacritical marks. If you haven't already memorized the basic hiragana, then please do that. I'm going to be going over this kind of a little bit quickly just because I think that it's really important for you to get the gist of, but you won't completely understand it unless you know the basics. So you can transcribe 23 additional sounds by adding diacritical marks. And what it means when I say transcribed is that you can make 23 more sounds by adding these little marks at the very top to all of the basic hiragana. And what that's going to do is it's going to make it a harsher sound. So instead of ka, it's going to sound ga. Instead of ki, it's going to be gi. And the same thing goes down along the way. So instead of sa, it's za. Instead of shi, it's going to be pronounced a little bit more like ji. Su is going to be zu, and so on and so forth. Another kind of diacritical mark are the little circle at the top, which right here is only going to affect the ha, the ones that the transcribe into ha, hi, fu, he, ho. And it changes into a pa sound. So pa, pi, pu, pe, po. And those are the only ones that I believe use the little circle, other than the katakana phonetic system, which we'll go over a little bit later. Does anybody have any questions about the diacritical marks before I go on? You can go ahead and unmute yourselves and ask a question. No questions?
So that's literally the only one that uses the circle?
Right here, yes. So like the katakana alphabet also has diacritical marks, and they have the pretty much the equivalent, and I believe it's going to make the same sounds pa, pi, pu, pe, po. But they're
So
different
so these are
characters.
transferred. So this chart's trans.
Go ahead.
So this chart's transferred to katakana too.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
So basically, the same goes for the katakana versions, and it's the same, or is there more?
It's pretty much the same. So the katakana version is pretty much a
It's the same, but
yeah,
written differently.
yeah. And I'll show you that a little bit later in the PowerPoint. So then transcribing contracted sounds. The contracted sounds are going to be pretty much like longer vowels. And in order to get these sounds, you're going to add the ya, you, and the yo characters. So they're going to follow these. And these are all the contracted sounds for hiragana, I believe. And they're used to make the longer vowels. And we'll see how that changes the pronunciation of some words later on, because I have some examples that specifically do that. And here we have some other graphs in case the pictures that I included in the previous slides weren't as clear. So you guys can go ahead and study off of these if you find them more helpful. For activity number 2, it's pretty much doing the same thing as activity number 1. Again, just helping you memorize it by writing it repeatedly. And then it also has the pronunciation guide that I included in the first activity, so you can go ahead and go back to those. So when you're transcribing double consonants, there's another smaller letter which can be used to create the sounds T and P, T and P. So what it does, it's going to create a more kata sound. Instead of kata, it's going to be kata, or saka, happa, zashi. So it creates a longer sound for how do you say it in English? I forgot what it was. What the consonants, of course. The consonants that come right after. So, and then the same thing kind of happens with the N. So, for example, sannen is written with N and then a hiragana with an initial N sound. So, na, ni, nu, ne, no. So if you put them together, it's gonna create the same kind of long consonant vowel sound. So double consonant. Any questions on this? And it is important to pronounce the double consonants when they come along, because it changes the meaning of the word. For example, right here we have one, like you one, and then over here we have shoulder. So you don't want to talk about shoulders when you're trying to talk about something else, right? So other issues that are related to transcription and pronunciation, that's kind of like a little table of contents of what we're going to be talking about. So some long vowels, when the same vowel is placed one right after the other, the pronunciation of the vowel becomes about twice as long as a single vowel. So be sure to hold out the sound long enough, because the length of the vowel can change one word to another. That's kind of like similar to what I was talking about with the double consonants. So you have to really pay attention to the way that you're pronouncing certain words, so that people can understand what you're trying to say. So oba-san, oji-san, or suji, in comparison to oba-san or oji-san, which, if you're talking about a grandmother, it's not an aunt, or an uncle isn't a grandfather. So just make sure that you are leaving enough space or in order to let them know about that pronunciation, or just emphasizing that part. And you have a couple of other examples, for example, e or u, that pretty much do the same thing. And there's different things to note for each one. I'll let you guys go over that just because I'm kind of going over this quickly. And again, N is treated like a full syllable in terms of length. Its pronunciation varies, however, depending on the sound values of N. Therefore, you do not need to worry too much about its pronunciation. So sometimes it'll be kind of important. You'll kind of get the gist of it as you learn more vocabulary. So it's something that you should, these tips are kind of something that you should keep in the back of your mind. But it isn't completely necessary right now as you're like complete beginners starting off to like focus too much on. So if you're focusing too much on these tips, remember to learn that you'll be learning these things as you learn more vocabulary and more grammar tips. And there's also, so N kind of changes the way that some things are pronounced. And again, you'll kind of learn it with vocabulary. So I'll keep this for your reference in the PowerPoint, but we're going to move on. So some vowels are dropped. I and U are sometimes dropped when placed between voiceless consonants or at the end of an utterance preceded by voiceless consonants. So if you've noticed in like animes, whenever they say this phrase, I like it, they don't say suki desu. They say suki desu. This is a perfect example of what this slide is trying to say. So you're not always going to pronounce things by the Romanji, which is why I kind of emphasize the fact that you should learn all of the pronunciations of what you're learning instead of learning through Romaji, because things like this happen and then you're stuck kind of with a foreign accent or speaking like a foreigner instead of actually trying to figure out how native Japanese sounds. So accents in the Japanese language, intonation matters a lot. So you're going to also want to constantly try to find sources where you can actually listen to how they speak or how they pronounce certain words, vocabulary. And this is why, like, if you go into certain programs or like if you listen to YouTube videos, it's going to help you so much more than just writing or learning from a book, because you really do need that practice, the listening practice. So high pitch, low pitch, namae, asa, takai. You kind of need to know how they also use intonation to speak and to get those words out. And that's going to help you also speak like a native Japanese person who knows the language and has been working with the language. So activity number 3, go back to the previous slides and sound out each example out loud. Try to get close enough to the pronunciation as you can, as the examples kind of state. So now we're going to be moving on to katakana, but does anybody have any questions about hiragana?
You write it down.
Do you write it down?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're talking about like writing down hiragana continuously, like practicing each of the characters, that's going to help you a lot in memorizing it. No matter like what it is, if you write it repeatedly, you're going to be able to memorize it at a faster rate. It takes time, it takes practice, and your hands are probably going to hurt after it. But that's how I learned the hiragana and katakana. So I feel like that's kind of the best way that I learn. That isn't to say that that's the best way that you guys are going to learn. So I'm going to give you guys also some other strategies in order to get or to learn it. For example, the pronunciation guide helps you pronunciate and kind of solidify how it sounded out in your head. It was a little bit easier for me because I know Spanish, and the Spanish language is very close to the pronunciation of the Japanese phonetic system. So like the vowels and the syllables were easy for me to remember and pronounce. It isn't so much when you're coming from just like English. So for only English speakers, you really should go to the pronunciation guide and remember that all of the different syllables are pronounced those different ways. And
Hey, what's up, guys?
hello. And if you want to write down the tips as well, that's perfectly okay. I mean, I'm going to keep the PowerPoint up, and these are basically my notes on the language systems. I just put it in PowerPoint form so that it would be easier for everybody else to have them. And these notes are also basically just off of the beginning of Genki, the Genki textbook. All right. So
I actually have a
yes,
question.
go ahead.
So you said that the Spanish accent was kind of like the Japanese accent?
Yes, so like if you know Spanish, Spanish is one of the languages that are actually closest to the pronunciations of Japanese. So if you learn Japanese through your understanding of Spanish, it'll be a little bit easier to understand the words. Because if, like, even for me when I was starting off, and I know English better than Spanish, I would read the hiragana. I'm going to go back to it really fast. Where is it? I would read hiragana starting off in Spanish as like ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, or a, I, u, e, o, ta, chi, she, but it has this accent where you really have to pronounce it as ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, ku, ke, ko, ki. You notice like the differences between the way that I pronounced it the first time, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, and ka, ki, ku, ke, ko.
Yeah, it's more pronounced or like I know the difference though. Thank you.
No worries. So that, and it is one of the like fun facts things that the way that Spanish is pronounced is closest to the way that Japanese is pronounced. So katakana has more straight lines. So if you notice, this one's not as, this is the same character that I had shown in the first slide for hiragana, so it's a. This one's completely straight lines. They're harsher, kind of. And katakana is normally used for writing loan words and foreign names. So if you want to write your name and you have a foreign name, then this is the alphabet you're going to want to use. And again, you want to go by the pronunciation, not by the romaji. So you have to pay attention to those details as you're writing your name. So they're very similar, a, I, U, E, O, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko, to this pronunciation of hiragana. It's just a different way of spelling the same system in order to differentiate it from their native words and their native language. Any questions on this? Nope. Okay. So they also have, did I put it? Oh, so the slides are kind of skewed. They also have diacritical marks. So again, gagi, gu, ge, go, zaji, zaji, zuzezo. That's going to change the pronunciation of some of the same characters you find on this side. It just makes the consonants a little bit harsher, more pronounced. And then, yep, pa, pi, pu, pe, po. They're the only ones that have the little circle at the very top. And then they also have the same, what is it called again? But you guys get it with the vowels, ya, yi. ya, yu, yo. They have the same thing going on with ka, kyu, ko, kyo, sha, shu, sho, cha, chu, cho. Hello, puppy.
Oh, sorry, what's up?
No worries. And then I also gave you guys the stroke order for it. Again, you want to make sure that you're using the stroke order in order to write down your characters, because it not only makes it neater, it also makes it easier for people to understand what you're writing, or where you're going, especially if they know this, they're used to the stroke order as well. And another thing to point out is that we and we are no longer used. You don't really have to pay attention to those two, but this was a really good guide for the stroke order of all the other characters. And they also have all the rules that hiragana has on pronunciation. So go back to hiragana and all the pronunciation things for the double consonants, for the N pronunciation, it all applies to katakana as well. Any other questions on katakana? Basically, it'll be easier for you guys to learn hiragana, and once you have a really solid foundation of hiragana, then you should start memorizing katakana. I find it easier to memorize katakana through vocabulary that I recognize. So the way that you spell America is going to be in katakana. And it's super easy for me to identify America now because I learned the katakana for it. So then here you go. Long vowels are written. Oh, that is another difference. So long vowels for katakana are going to be written with this little dash. So ka, suki, sutsu, keki, guru. And if you're writing it vertically, then it's going to be vertical as well. So that's actually one difference from the hiragana pronunciations and spellings that I forgot. And then they have a different set of transcribing foreign sounds with small vowels. So they have some additional combinations that you wouldn't find in hiragana, but it's only words that you would find in foreign alphabets. So that's one of the reasons why you wouldn't find it in the hiragana alphabet, or like pronunciations or guide. So this is just based on the different sounds that foreign languages make and how they transcribe them or how they learn to write them in Japanese. And V also has a little difference where sometimes they'll write it one way or sometimes they'll write it another way, but it's meant to be the same thing. You just have to watch out for it.
One question.
Yes.
When you use V, like with a V, wouldn't it be the same as using be with BE? Or is there any difference between the two?
So that's...
Because it sounds really similar.
Yeah. So that's like one of the things that it has right here is that usually they'll use like Venus with the BE, but sometimes they'll also use the... What is it called again? The different ways, the additional combination in order to transcribe the same sound. So it's kind of a similar sound. This you wouldn't find in the hiragana alphabet. They made it specifically for transcribing foreign alphabets, but you can find it in both ways, or you can write it both ways.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. For activity 5, it was pretty much the same thing as activity 3. Just go back to all of those examples like the Halloween and transcribing things and try to sound it out, to try to figure it out by sound. And I find these activities a little bit easier just because they are foreign words, so we're more familiar with them. But do try to still pronunciate it the way that Japanese people would pronunciate it, because if you say it with a native English accent, they won't understand what you're saying. So that's also important to note that any words written in katakana are still to be pronounced in katakana or Japanese, because they understand them through Japanese. So this was a little activity to try to get you to see the differences between hiragana and katakana. If you want, we can go through it or we can skip it. But basically, it's just identifying one alphabet from another. So for example, the first one, where the red dot is, which one do you guys think that one uses?
Katakana.
Yes, thank you. Okay. And then the one right underneath it would be?
That's kanji, right? Am I right?
No.
Dude, dang. I thought I was smart.
You are smart. It's hiragana. So then the only kanji that's actually on this page is over here, and it's for Nihongo. And all the answers are going to be on the next page that pretty much has them as the vocab. And then the K is katakana, the H is hiragana, and there's only one kanji. So you guys can go ahead and practice through that little tiny activity. For kanji, I don't have like examples of kanji. I'm just going to talk about it. So kanji are Chinese characters that represent not just sounds but also meanings. Kanji are usually used for nouns and the stems of verbs and adjectives. So in the very beginning of the PowerPoint, we had the kanji for to see, miru. And if you could remember, it also had hiragana characters right next to it that conjugated the verb. So instead of being miru, it was mimasu for that sentence. So that was a stem of a verb. How many kanji are there? There's actually like more than 50,000 kanji. And nobody knows that many kanji, not even native Japanese people. The amount of kanji that you guys actually need to like learn or be able to recognize are about 2,000 kanji. And then if you really want to like study hard and get to, let's say, a Japanese professional like linguist version or like knowledge, I don't know what to say about it, but you'd pretty much memorize 5,000. That's how much like a really well educated kanji Japanese language professional would know. On average, Japanese people can recognize up to 8,000 kanji, but they recognize that amount of kanji based on their knowledge of the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 kanji that they do know really well. So some kanji are based off of simpler forms of kanji, or like written into more complex forms of kanji. And as long as you start small and build your knowledge by getting into more complex kanji, you'll be able to understand most of it. And then there's like a little piece of advice, learn kanji by radicals. What is a radical? They're the building blocks of kanji. You don't actually need to do this step. This is, again, formatted for my learning. You guys might just like skip through the radicals and just memorize the kanji as they are. But I thought that this was interesting or easier to learn from, because the radicals carry their own meanings and sounds. And similar to the thought of like there's more simpler forms of kanji and more complex forms of kanji, the radicals are the building blocks of kanji. So if you know the radicals, most likely than not, they kind of build towards the meaning that the kanji is meant to represent. That isn't always the case. And lots of people have pointed out the fact that sometimes kanji are just complicated and you just have to memorize them that way. And that's true. But you'll get that once you get through the advanced stages of Japanese. And yeah, there's some really complicated kanji. There are like 20 strokes. So strokes, if you memorize the radicals, then you'll automatically already know the way that they're supposed to be written. You don't have to memorize each individual stroke within the kanji. Types of radicals. Some of the like pointers if you're going to be reading or learning through radicals is that radicals are generally formed from characters that have been simplified. For example, these two, they're basically the same characters that you would find in the hiragana and katakana alphabets within radicals, and they would be written in the same stroke order. And even though they have the same, even they can have different forms but still have the same meaning. So these two radicals still mean human, but they're written differently. Alternatively, they can also be written the same way but have different meanings, and that's why it kind of gets complicated once you get into more complicated kanji. And this is my last slide because I wasn't getting too much into kanji. I just wanted to introduce it because it was part of the phonetic writing system and because it is important to learn them. But I put in some resources such as like the Kanji Radicals cheat sheet, Mastering Kanji, Learning Hiragana. This is going to be a really good guide. Tofugu in general is going to be a really good guide for learning the basics. So hiragana, they also have a guide for katakana if you look through it, or I think you can find it through this page too. The pronunciation guide is the website that I also put in the beginning on the slides. 15-Minute Japanese was a useful one. I think it's a book though. Learning Japanese, a ridiculously detailed guide, is again a Tofugu site. So Tofugu is a really good place to go to. And then these are in case you want to learn a little bit more. They're just general resources, so like culture or the Google extension for reading Japanese online. That's going to be great if you want to learn or start reading through websites and whatnot. And so yeah, you should start learning hiragana, then kind of go on to learning katakana and kanji. But hiragana is going to be the most important thing to learn first. Know some katakana so that you're not completely caught off guard on some examples or sentences that you're going to start practicing as you learn more complex grammar and so on. And then you'll gradually start learning kanji as you learn more vocabulary. Any questions on this? Or any questions in general?
I'm curious about one thing.
Yep.
Not related to the grammar and everything. It's more, would a Japanese person have more difficulties learning like a Roman language like English or Spanish than a person who speaks English or Spanish to Japanese?
I mean, that's difficult to...
Say that again.
Go ahead.
Okay, so a Japanese person learning English would have the same difficulty as a English person learning Japanese.
I personally don't. Go ahead.
I don't know.
As a Japanese person, learning English wasn't like too hard, but I think an English person learning Japanese is harder because of like the accents and everything in it.
And I was
because
also...
Japanese is such a complex language.
Yeah, just weirdly complicated.
It is very complicated. I was also going to say that the way that Japanese has a system to conjugate its verbs and stuff is very similar to Roman languages, such as like French, Italian, and Spanish. So they might have a better understanding of their own grammar systems than English would. English is a little funky in that sense because we don't really conjugate as much for specific types of verbs. So it also depends on like person to person. But no worries. All right, so I just wanted to also show some of the resources that I had. Tofugu, it's not loading, but it's fine. So Tofugu also has a system of mnemonics that they use in order to help you learn the alphabet if you want to go through that. They have, I don't actually prefer their mnemonics, but it might help some people, so I'm still keeping it as a resource. There's also this picture of mnemonics that's posted in the learning materials, I think, or hiragana or katakana channel. And you guys can go ahead and access that by either searching mnemonics or searching through the pins. This was the pronunciation guide that I had included. I don't know if you'll be able to listen to the example because my computer does not share sound unless it doesn't look like it. But if you go specifically to any of the characters that you want to listen to, or like the contracted sounds, it'll play it for you. And it also has the stroke order, so that you guys can see if you have any questions going back. It also has a katakana. I don't recommend the kanji section just because it's like little lessons on the kanji and it only has one at a time. But I really liked the hiragana and the katakana resources for that. And then we also have the Google Drive for the classes that are shown on the Zoom sessions with Maru. So I really recommend going through all the lessons or the notes that they've had before, because that also has important grammar points once you start getting the hang of hiragana and katakana, grammar points that you can use to practice them.